Hey, I'm Taylor Dorsett, and this is the Professional Technical Interviewee. Technical interviews are hard, and every company does them differently. On this show, I interview engineering leaders to see what they look for in technical candidates, and then they perform a real technical interview with me. I hope you enjoy. Great. Well, welcome back, Arne. The ball is in your court now for the interview portion.
So, yeah, as we talked about, Taylor, we have a phone script that we go through. So I'm going to take a couple of the questions that are more technical oriented on that phone script to kind of focus on that. But there's other questions that would be covering other aspects of your career. But these won't initially sound technical, but we'll go into it and you'll see where I kind of go and the process of whether we determine, your level of background and your experience, because there's two reasons for it. One is obviously to find out if you're a match. And two is, if you're coming in, we want to make sure that we level you properly so that you're A, not over your head, and B, you're not being challenged, so that you're in the right place, give you a chance to grow and continue to move up. So we would dig deeper into this in the further interviews, but this is just something to kind of give us an initial indication.
Great.
All right. So first question would be, what is a feature that you worked on that you're most proud of? Something that you really feel that you've accomplished something?
Yeah, so at my last job levels, the last big feature I built before I left was basically this homepage feature where we added static website. It just spit out the same 3 companies every time people went to the website. Basically the goal of this project was to put customized companies based off of people's location and the companies that we have leveling in comparison, like salary data for. So it was a fairly big project that I did mostly on my own, maybe a little help with some SQL stuff that was already pre-existing, but got that shipped, and basically it's on the homepage that a couple 100,000 people per day click on, right? Which is felt pretty good, less than a kind of a year into my career to get that out.
Yeah, 100,000. So that's a decent number of clicks. So did you guys? You're doing this. Did you have to make the decision on the front end of what to display people, or were you able to hit an API in the background to pull this?
Yeah, great question. So basically everything was done through fetch requests, right? So the front end would just register the user, and then everything else we would push out. We'd pull their IP address. Then from their IP, I had to hit another, forgetting it was some third-party API that I was querying to get their it was like DMA ID, right? Which is what is the kind of marketing zones, and that's what we catalog cities by, right? So it's trying to get their city from there or their country, and then from that querying our database to get back what are the companies that match with that we have data for.
So, and I assume the third-party one that was set up for scale so that you guys didn't really have to worry about response times. And did you have a fairly small package coming back, or was it
it was a small, just a little JSON package that really all it spit back was like a couple different ID things, right? So we're talking really tiny package that it returned. That was actually the piece that took the most amount of time, just because we were taking in that IP address. Then I had to query that external one before we could run our database query. The database query I could we optimized as much as we could, right? But that piece was kind of the unknown. And still if you go to the website, about basically the first time you go, you might not always get customized results, because I had the timeout set to like 300 milliseconds or something for that piece, because we wanted the total query to be like less than 500 milliseconds, right? So that was the piece that I couldn't really control on how long was it going to take that external API to return.
What would you guys display with it timed out?
Just the same thing we did before, which was those set.
So the static set. Okay, yeah. Gotcha. What was the 300 milliseconds? You were saying it timed out sometimes. How often? What was your success rate on getting that back?
Great question. We didn't do like really granular testing. That was an interesting part about working at that company. Was our metrics were very much users and like growth, right? Rather than so our testing was more so like, does this break things, or are we seeing a noticeable drop on either of those two metrics, rather than doing real A/B feature flag testing, right? That being said, I would say, I don't know, 20% of the time you might get back those standard results. I just went to the website yesterday. I was like, oh, I got back the standard results, and then I refreshed, and it came back with what I was expecting, right? So it's
And
interesting.
with a 5-second timeout, would you guys display the standard results at the end of 5 seconds, or would you display them and then like screen morph into the new results?
We would just display the standard one. So it was a 300 millisecond timeout from that API. And if we didn't get anything back from that API, we wouldn't even do the database call. So it would just return. So the longest you would ever potentially wait was 5, but it was, the 300 milliseconds was, if we knew we weren't going to get anything back, like you would get the results by then.
All right. So a lot of people, if that failed, it was almost instantaneous as far as reception was.
And that was all modeled on the front end. So that would just display, right?
All right. Let's move to the second query. So that one was at a REST API, GraphQL. Where did you guys
get the REST API?
REST API. Did you write that, or is that already existing for you?
That existed. I edited it to basically take in, like we needed to pull IPs from that, but that existed already. Yep.
And did you have to worry about you mentioned you guys had already optimized that query. Did you have to worry at all about that, or go into the database and check that it still worked with the new criteria?
I had to write the database query. We had tables that existed already that I was able to use. I did actually make a whole slew of tables. We had 2 different ways we tried to do it. One where I created a whole new table that had basically the data optimized as much as possible. So all we had to feed it was basically one little identifier, which was their location, to try to return that as quickly as possible. We actually realized after the fact, and basically from not wanting to make additional tables, that we then had to keep updated all the time, right? That we could do a join, and it took, on average, it was a very small difference. It was just slightly longer that it took to do a couple different joins, and we didn't even have to make that other table. So it would basically be updated for us at any given moment. That query was significantly more complicated. So I did have one of our lead engineers who helped me with basically I wrote it, and then he was like, okay, we can strip out these things and do it slightly different way here, and made it a little bit faster.
Cool. When you say the table was optimized, how was that? How was it optimized for queries?
So when I made that table, my goal was basically to only include the data we absolutely needed, right? Which was, I think, a DMA ID, code for their country, and then just the 3 company names that were going to be returned, right? So that's all it was going to return. We had a different call that actually took those company names and then would generate the front end code we needed, or return all the actual data that the front end needed to populate.
So was that part of? Did you guys have 2 API calls, or was that part of like the logic to consolidate the data?
Yeah, it was 2 different database calls. So we had one call just to get the names of the companies, and then one call to basically get the data associated with those companies. So whenever we had a company name, we had to get levels, salary data, basically everything that showed up in the actual UI on the front end, and return that. But that one was that was pre-existing. So all I had to basically do was a query to get the name specifically for the company to feed that into this existing query.
And how did you populate that table? Was it like a one-time load, or did you guys have to keep that updated? The table you created.
The table I created, the reason we didn't end up going with that was because we would have had to update it weekly, or I think most of we had a number of jobs that would basically update things weekly, and that. The reason we didn't go with it was just because that kept getting longer and longer, that weekly update, just based off the amount of data we had that continued to scale. But it wasn't super complicated I wrote that worker query to basically to do that update. But we had a bunch of jobs that were doing that all in the same file. It just took, at that point, I think like 20 minutes or something every time that ran. And we were recognizing that as this continues to scale and as the company continues to scale, 20 minutes can quickly become an hour. And then, at any point that could fail and you got issues, right?
Yep. Was that a flush and refresh job, or would it just add new records on the back?
No, it was what was the term we used? Upstart.
Yep.
Yeah, upstart, where
update and insert combined. So if it was, if it updated, if it found it, inserted it if it didn't.
Yes. So we regularly had new companies that were being added and new data points that were being added. So we had a couple basically ways to track where if this was a new company, we'd have a certain threshold of data points to add something or add a company to our database. So once we hit that threshold, then it would insert that into our database, would generate basically some different pages on the front end. So we had a company page for that. And otherwise it would just look and see if we had any new data points to add to that. If we didn't, then we just skip that, right? And we had maybe we're close to 2,000 companies. So there's a significant amount, but not like it wasn't a million, right? So the data points were the thing that was more frequent than the actually adding new companies.
And let's move on. So you got the data results back, right?
Mm-hmm.
What'd you do to parse that and make it into a web page?
Yeah. So once we returned, basically what was returned was our payload was 3 different company it's called company models, right? Or company data models that has their name. It has a bunch of different set of like specific criteria that we knew we were going to use on the front end, right? That then we would use to populate this data. There was a couple different functions. I ended up modifying this kind of everything on the homepage lived in one big file, right? So it was kind of I would say very what's the right word? Fragile to some extent, right? So
Yeah.
there was kind of an existing call that could have made that database call. I ended up making something similar that would just make that call if someone was a first-time visitor, right? So we could just get back those suggested companies. Ended up at some point actually having to make another one where if they were a first-time visitor and then also accounted for someone on the homepage adding and removing other companies because we had kind of a comparison function. But that ran through and we had this existing function that I had to edit, not terribly significantly, but because again, it was fragile, it was significant amount of work, just making sure testing it, making sure it worked properly. But it would go through and look at each of those companies, basically loop through them, populate a number of different areas on the screen based off of the data that was in there. And then once it basically checked through what was returned from our backend calls, it would be done and that would actually populate. And before it would actually populate, we had kind of some loading buffers that just so the page wouldn't jump around once those things loaded in.
What'd you display on your buffer?
They were just blank grayish boxes that had, I think they have vaguely look like a loading-ish thing.
Yeah,
right?
like a little circle spinning or something.
Yeah, I never noticed we had them until I messed them up one day and I went, why does the page look so weird before we load it? And then I was like, oh, I'm missing those boxes. Right.
Was this JavaScript?
This is all full stack JavaScript. Really just full stack
just plain old
Node.
HTML.
Yeah.
Oh no. Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, we use some interesting stuff like gulp on the front end to do some like data processing, but the API calls were just fetch calls.
Yep. Makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. So at this point, I would say, I would generally move on to the next question because I've gotten good indication of A, you did the work, you passed the BS test, and B, that you can explain it to a reasonable level. My assessment on this one, and we'll do a similar one in a second, would be essentially you are an SE2, which is you're comfortable doing the work, you're comfortable understanding the work, but you're not in a position where you usually determine the work that needs to be done, which puts you probably in my category, puts you about an SE2.
Well, that's my current level of my current job. So
we're pretty close there. But the way I get this and is you were able to describe the details of what you're doing, right? You were able to describe what you set up. You did some work of like configuring creating a table and other things, but generally you relied, based on the way you answered, you relied on guidance from more senior engineers about how you should do it and the approach you should take. But you were certainly above an SE1 who would, have very curated path. It sounded like you were able to take some work on your own and make some of your own decisions along the way.
Yeah.
So second question is very similar. Now, normally we would go through like 4 or 5 questions in between that are more culturally focused and also talking about like, tell me something you really screwed up and how you screwed it up and what you learned from that, those kinds of questions, right? In between to kind of separate these two, but I like to do it twice because this one is a little bit loaded. Sometimes people don't give me a technology answer and then I'll dig into what they're proud of that wasn't technology. So I'll get a chance to be that. And 2, like everybody deserves 2 chances to demonstrate what they know, right? So the second one will go into your resume. Just give me a second here. So is it Ancilia Partners? Is that how
Ancilla. Yeah.
Ensela Partners? All right. So yeah, it was good reason I should never become an English major. Says you worked on several products to better access their data in a
Mhm.
variety of language, Ruby, Rails, JavaScript to say. So, all right. So where did this, let's start with where did this data reside? Why was it hard for people to access
Yeah, so there's kind of two types of clients that we had there. One was like hospital or something healthcare related, and one was like typical government agency, which whatever category that might fall under, right?
it?
So sometimes we were specifically cleansing their data or basically building portals that they could input files into, so then some third party could audit their data. So sometimes we were the auditors, sometimes we just built the portals to audit them, and then a project I did a significant amount of work on was specifically with a hospital system where they were inputting. It wasn't necessarily sensitive data, but it was just hospital room data where they were checking off if a room was cleaned and making sure that there was a whole checkbox of various different things they clicked off. So that made it so rather than having a whole bunch of paper reports, right, that these people were filling out or that the custodians would be filling out, there was actually all done on the platform and was much more visible, right? So we could generate reports based off of the platform and made it a lot easier for their supervisors to see, oh, 30 rooms are done, 3 of them were done not at the level we were expecting, and 2 of them still need to be done, right?
So the custodian or whatever, they have a iPad or something. How would they track it on as they were going around?
Yeah, I think so. So the big piece that I built was basically making it mobile. So before they had laptops, but it's supposed to be a checklist that you were
Got
supposed to do in real time. But the app functioned in a way where they couldn't leave it open. There was some sensitive data within that application. So if you walked away from it, you had to sign off.
Hospital, yeah.
Yeah, so it's impossible to do it in real
Right.
time unless you came back quick, so it just didn't work well. So I built the mobile version. So I think they were all iPhone 7s that they were working off of. So basically they could do it on their phone in real time.
Was it a website or did you actually use like a Swift or an Objective C program to do it?
It's a it was all done through HTML and CSS, like media styling rules. So it was a really interesting way to do it. And it's also like the first big project I worked on. So looking back at it, I would definitely do it in a different way now. But I didn't know what I didn't know then, and that some of the work was done in that direction. So I just continued down that path.
Where'd you guys host it? Was it hosted locally? Like, was it a local host or was it actually hosted at some external hosting site?
That's a good question. Like the website's live, like you can go to it. So I'm assuming it's hosted X, and we didn't have if you're asking where were the servers based, we didn't have anything that was up and running, right? So I think we did everything through AWS.
Well, it's just, but if you're not using localhost, it wasn't running on a local server. So if you can get to it externally, it's got to be hosted at some. But
yes,
you didn't actually have to do the hosting. Somebody did that for you, I'm assuming.
I mean, I was testing everything on my own local host, right? Like I had that up and running. But yes, when they were running it was off of a production website. Right?
Okay, somebody else handled the deployment and getting it up and running in that environment for you. Cool. So we talked about cleansing the data. Was it in this project, did you actually have to go back and cleanse historical data, or was it just making sure that future data was clean?
No, so I didn't do a lot of that cleanse data in this project. Mostly it was just ensuring that I didn't mess up anything that already existed where we were cleansing some amount of data, right? And it was more so access. So this was we had multiple different hospitals on the same system, and this was a thing I ran into frequently. Is like, okay, which hospitals can see what and which admins can see what, because sometimes admins oversaw 3 different hospitals and sometimes they only oversaw 1, right? And then obviously a custodial worker shouldn't be able to access other records, right? So that was, and this was also partially in PHP, which isn't a language I'm an expert in. So there was a weird amount of difficulty involved in just limiting access and making sure that we never messed that up, right? Or just like when someone clicked on one thing, like they only saw what they were supposed to see and nothing else was generated. So that was the biggest probably data piece of it. And I know we did have some issues with that because there would be administrators who might need 4 hospitals instead of 3. And then all of a sudden we have to make some type of, if our database was just set for anyone who's in this system to see these hospitals, now we have to make some type of change, right?
Did you have any experience with the authentication and authorization layer, or did you just kind of tap into something that existed?
Yeah, I didn't have any experience with that at all. And I also didn't have very much database experience. I mean, any database experience at that point as well. So it was a huge learning experience from like a SQL perspective of like, what do we need? Like, why are we writing these queries and what are they limiting? It was also, this sounds silly, but my first experience with like aliases within SQL. So I realized like, oh, it's just a huge amount of work for me to read through and actually understand a SQL query effectively
Mhm.
of like, what is this saying? Because by the time we're 3 lines into this 25-line SQL query, I'm not even understanding what we're referencing, right? And like going back to and
Yeah.
learning that was a fun experience.
Let's take it from you got more experience now. So if you were to approach this problem now, where are areas, or go back to it, what are areas you'd really want to tackle and make it change your approach? Where things that you feel that you did that with more experience now you'd want to like have a second shot at?
Yeah, well, we weren't using like responsive web design, which would have made this entire thing easier, right? So like I was doing a lot of like customizing of like just like pixel perfect CSS stuff rather than being like, oh, if we drag this and we made it responsive, this most of it could be done on its own, right? So like that's a big thing is just recognizing there's solutions for this thing that I was doing in a really cumbersome way. And then we also did a lot of I was doing a lot of hiding and showing of HTML elements depending on if something was a mobile or a non-mobile screen. Because while we built the mobile side, we also had to have the other side of it functioning, and the data had to be the same on both, which also seemed surprisingly complicated at the time. So just recognizing that there's ways for us to do mobile development better, even if we're not going a full native approach, right? We could at least use some responsive web design. And testing. We were like 2 months into that project before I found out that testing on a Chrome emulated small version of a screen is different than actually testing on an iPhone. So I was like, we're ready to release. And then someone tested it on their iPhone 7 and went, this doesn't line up at all, right? And I went, and then I had to go and actually find a real emulator to test that, because that was a unforeseen hurdle at the end to get over, right? Because there's just differences, right, in how things render.
And you mentioned talk a little bit about doing the database queries. Uh, did you get a chance in there to write your own queries? It seemed that you did.
Yeah, that was definitely my start. Going through the boot camp where I learned we did some minor database stuff, but it was nothing complicated, right? We're selecting basic data versus like these are. I think the hardest part was pre-existing queries that were pretty meaty that I had to be able to understand, contextualize, and then make changes to or make some similar type of query, right, that I was going to get some different data from. It just took me a long time because I didn't really have a background in it. And I think the biggest thing that I learned from that and try to keep in mind is like when I'm thinking of web development, I think a lot in the terms of like maybe the easiest way to do something is looping or mapping or reducing or something like that versus the database. Maybe like we're joining or making new tables or making new columns, right? Which is almost, you're kind of solving the same problem, just in like very different tools. And at the time, my brain, struggled to get around that. I was like, why can't we just loop through this? It'd be 2 seconds if we could do this versus like, okay, we'll just make another table and based off of a join. And it's just functionally the same thing, right? That I'm trying to do if I was going to loop through it. Right. So that was a learning experience.
And you mentioned that there were similar queries, like so you're generating multiple. Like, were there multiple queries that almost did the same thing? And
Yeah.
not for yours, but in general, for the whole group.
Yeah, and some of that was just it depended on the hospital, right? Like this hospital might need something and they have very specific columns and very specific data sets that they need and absolutely have to be there versus this hospital doesn't need that at all. And it's just making again, sort of like fragile code, but it's like if we're including columns that don't exist or this other hospital doesn't need it all, we're going to get error results versus hey, we need to make a customized query for this hospital that just runs if this is what's being sent to the database side. So that was certainly a piece of it that looking back on it doesn't seem that complicated, but at the time I was like, why can't we just use the same query, right? But this property didn't exist, this column didn't exist, right?
Tell me a little bit about your mentorship there. Who was your mentor and how were they guiding you?
Yeah, I had we had a lead engineer who did I think a a very good job of kind of running the ship from like a development perspective. There was also a more senior engineer who'd just been with the company for a number of years. I don't think he was a leader, even senior in title, but just understood the backend and actually was kind of the go-to PHP person for the office. So whenever there was PHP stuff, it was a lot of time me and him spending looking at it. A lot of the actual code was written by the CTO several years ago, which was interesting. So like seeing stuff similar to what you mentioned, in the first half of like sometimes the patterns or just the maybe the design decisions were different than what we might think of as standard nowadays. So sometimes it was me and this other engineer going, okay, we recognize that maybe this isn't how we would do this today, but is this worth changing, or is this worth just fixing to what we need it to be, right? And that was always that was probably the most enjoyable piece of that project, was seeing like, okay, sometimes we just have to figure out what are the trade-offs, right, and what's worth doing and what's not. But there's definitely a little there was a lot to do and a lot to learn, but I think those two engineers were pretty helpful in helping guide me through that process, because I didn't know that language. I didn't really know SQL stuff well, and it was my first time ever doing something in the healthcare world that involved like any amount of protected data, right?
Yeah, HIPAA and all that. But
yeah,
if looking back on it, if you were to be the mentor going with somebody coming out of a boot camp, what would you do? Like what would you did you learn from those guys, and what would you like try to approach differently with somebody you were trying to mentor?
Great question. We didn't really have ticketing. We had some ticketing, but we didn't have great ticketing, or at least very clear acceptance criteria. Now, having been at other companies that have, that would be a big piece. If whether that was me doing that or trying to instill some of that, right? Like that was actually a thing that I tried to get up and running when I was leaving. There is like just more clear expectations from the get-go, right? And I think that would help someone like myself. Coming in, I didn't really even realize how much work it was going to be, because it was like, we're just building a little mobile piece of this, right? Which ended up being fairly complicated. So that would be one piece of just trying to set clear expectations and scope the project better from the get-go. The other thing, and this is kind of in the same vein, but probably just having smaller chunks, right? Like rather than saying this whole project is the goal, it's okay, our goal is to build the mobile version of this first piece this week, right? And then next week, maybe we don't even talk about this with them, but next week, as the senior folks, we know we're gonna build this piece and this piece, assuming things go well, right? And we don't run into any other issues. So just trying to scope that project better, I think would be the big thing that I would try to do now. Maybe a little bit more pair programming early on, especially just on like some PHP stuff, or like walk through the project to be like, okay, do you get how some of this is working, or like this is kind of the core area I think you're going to be working in. So like any questions around this, or like take some time, does it make sense to walk through this? Which they probably did, and I'm just forgetting now. But maybe a little bit more hand holding and scoping early on, I think would have been helpful in the long run, just because there was definitely some stuff at the tail end of that project where I'm like, oh, knowing this a month and a half ago would have been helpful, right?
So, and that would be probably where I would leave off on this one. Similar to the first one, I know this is a more junior one, so I expected you to discuss it and have a level of embarrassment about what you did, because most people's junior programs do, which I got. But from what I got from that is you were able to, basically you were given something above your level at the time, and you were able to work through it. You had to get a little creative by interpretation, that you didn't always know the right tools and the right techniques, but you were able to figure something out to get through it. But you also apparently took advice, because you had some areas where you wanted to do something, and I'm gathering from your mentors that they're like, yeah, don't do that. That's not the way to do it. And they may not have explained it to you in a way that you really got at the time, but you did take direction and stay away from those areas they told you to. Also got from you, that talking to you about it, that you have progressed in that you understand how to break down problems better. Basically, the mentorship question is a disguised, it sounds like a cultural question, but it is a question for me to see how well you understood the process you went through and how you would now improve that process, right? So it's a way of me understanding that you can see like, hey, there was flaws, but I see how to make those flaws better. But what you did not do, which is the cultural side, which is you did not criticize anybody, which, you didn't say like, well, this guy didn't do this or this guy didn't do that. You took it as they did a good job, but, looking back on it, I might have tweaked it some, which is a good thing that you didn't take the approach that, these guys were doofuses, right?
Sure.
But you also demonstrated that you learned from the experience. You have a better opportunity to do that, and you could mentor somebody who's a more junior programmer to move forward. So it gives me perspective that you can break down problems, you can work with more junior programmers, and that you have learned from your experience and move forward. So that is kind of my technique of doing phone screen tech interviews. It's hidden. It's not an obvious tech question, but it's me proving that you didn't put anything that was BS down.
Sure.
Because there's people that do put things on the resume that they can't explain, which bad habit. Don't ever do that.
Sure. Yeah.
And it's largely to see that you have problems, you think a way through problems, and that you can do that. I would again assess you as around a SE2 based on that discussion as well.
Yeah.
So maybe a little different than the ones you've done in the past, but that's just an early indicator. That's the gatekeeper kind of tech interview for me, to make sure that you have the necessary skills to move you forward to a more full-blown tech interview.
Yeah, I like it. And I feel like it's more engaging too certainly more engaging than here's the leak code question. Let's both stare at it, for the next half hour. But also, like, I don't know if anyone's asked me questions in a way where I've had some people say, like, describe a project you're interested in, right? And then kind of dug into it a little bit. But especially that one at Ancilla, like, I haven't thought about that project really since I've done it. So it's interesting to be like, oh, it's, interesting to think through, like, how would I do it differently? Because I definitely know, like, I don't think everything on that project went swimmingly, but I don't think I've specifically sat down and thought through, like, what would I do differently about that. So that's a great question.
And it's I don't know how often people use that technique, but I find it a pretty decent assessment in a short period of time, right?
Sure.
I think you don't want to spend an hour on the phone texting somebody, right? We want to do it in a decent amount of time and get a decent hit on where they're at, so that you can decide whether they're a fit for what you're looking for. And it's also very tech agnostic. I'm as I mentioned earlier, I do believe interviews should be tech agnostic. I mean, you have to be able to explain basics, but I don't care what API you use. I don't care what tech. There's basic components that you should be able to talk through in a way that you're not throwing a bunch of jargon at me, which makes me suspicious that you're throwing jargon at me and not describing what you did.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks so much. Any other advice or tips you want to share before we wrap up?
In general, I like to, like what you did in a couple of times is you showed a genuine, you had not excitement necessarily, but there was like a passion to what you did, right? Mm-hmm. Even when you're a little embarrassed about the way you did this one, like there's also some pride behind it, and I was able to figure it out, right? You didn't use any of those phrases, but I could see that from you, and that's an important thing when you're being interviewed, like to show that you really have a passion for what you did, have some pride in what you did. Even when I'm asking you about mistakes that you made, to like say, oh yeah, but it's that caring for what you do and doing that. To me, and I don't know, to everybody, but to me, that shows somebody who's willing to learn, really to move forward, and somebody I would want to be working with. So it's got to be genuine, right?
Sure.
So if I ask you something you're proud of, really, don't pick the best story. Pick something that you are proud of, even if you're like, hey, it might not be the most complicated thing, but I was proud that I was able to knock this out. So I think, the things that you really care about comes through, and that's a better story than what might be what you think is your best story, because it sounds cool.
Sure. And the excitement comes through, right? Of like, oh, this person, I call it, they give a shit, right?
Actually, exactly. Care, you have to really give a shit. And if you really give a shit, it comes across, and it's a better story than what you think is, oh, this was a cool thing because everybody told me it was, but
Sure. Yeah. It got a big thumbs up by the stakeholders, right? Even if you hated the project.
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool. Well, Farmers Fridge, I'm assuming is hiring.
Well, we are. We'll be hiring for the rest of the year. We're going to be probably looking to double the team the following year. So there'll be lots of spots if you're interested.
Cool. Great. Well, we'll find Arne on LinkedIn or anywhere else. Anything else you want to plug?
Nope, I think I'm good. Thank you, Taylor.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, thanks so much. Thank you for watching the technical interview portion of the Professional Technical Interviewee. If you want to tackle this interview question, you can find it at github.com/professional technical interviewee. New episodes are released on the first 4 Thursdays of each month. Find us on YouTube at youtube.com/Taylor Dorsett or on Apple Podcast or Spotify. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on new episodes. And remember, keep practicing.